Good afternoon, good morning, good day, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us for the Oxford Internet Institute's sixth webinar of the term, featuring Professor Lilly Irani, hosted by Professor Philip Howard, who today will be discussing chasing innovation, entrepreneurship, and its limits in modern India. A little housekeeping. We are fortunate to have a varied audience with a wide range of views, and we request that the opinions of others are respected in this space. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. You can pose any question using the Q&A tab at any time, and these will be answered towards the end of the talk. Questions can be upvoted and commented upon, and will be visible to all attendees, and we will endeavour to follow up on any unanswered queries. Please allow me to introduce Professor Philip Howard.
Good evening, good morning. Thank you, Isabel, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to host Professor Irani for this session of our Wednesday webinars. There's several things that make Professor Irani special, and I'll just do a brief introduction and pass to her fairly quickly. Of the things that make her special, the first is perhaps that she is interesting for being a fairly traditional ethnographer. She spends months, if not years, in a field site, spending time through this particular book manuscript with a design firm, but also getting to know the network around the design firm. And the manuscript that was based on this ethnographic immersion hit the book market around the same time as Professor Verteshi's Seeing Like a Rover and Amrude's Encoding Race. So a very sort of special moment in how we were theorizing about the relationship between technology, innovation, and society. A special moment because there were three very deep books on the close relationship between how individuals imagine what they're doing in their technology work, and sometimes the distance between their imagination and what's actually produced in what they designed. So first, Professor Irani's, in my mind, a fairly traditional ethnographer with a classical skill set, and that makes her interesting. The second thing is that she's also, in an interesting way, a master of political economy as method. And in most of our schools now, we don't actually teach political economy as method anymore. We certainly read Marx, and we sometimes pick out the readings from Castells that look like political economy. But she's a master, I think, through this book of a craft of political economy, research political economy as method that is definitely worth paying attention to. So if anyone out there is interested in exploring what political economy looks like as method, Professor Irani's book is a wonderful place to start. I think the third thing that makes her interesting has to do with her family. She's part of a very important theoretical tradition at UCSD, probably the school with the single richest theoretical contribution to the study of technology, media, and society out there. And so her own home base, UCSD, I think is part of what makes her gives the context for how she does such excellent work, and also gives her the platform for thinking the way as creatively as she does, as globally as she does with her research. So welcome, Lilly. It's wonderful to have you here at Oxford. Look forward to having your insights and learning about what you're thinking about through this latest manuscript. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the really kind introduction, and also, for noting the way that in my work it's really important to bring ethnography, which is the study of practices and how people imagine themselves, together with the real kind of shifts in policy and economic structures that shape those experiences. I also used to work in a tech company at Google in Silicon Valley, and I think a lot of the drive to bring together these kinds of everyday practices with political economy also came from the fact that I myself, as a worker in the tech sector, had a hard time making those connections, and in some sense, like, working on this book was a chance to work slowly to try to unearth those connections. And my hope is that the book is for people who are, for people who are themselves maybe working or aspiring to engage in entrepreneurial practices, and the book is in some ways helpful in diagnosing what some of the limits of entrepreneurship as a structure for kind of bettering our society and driving our economy might be. So with that, I will pull up my slides, and thank you for everybody who's come here today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Let's see, share screen. And I see there's a poll up. I'm really excited to see the results of the poll myself. So, oh, great. Well, thank you all for being here. So in this talk, I've described some of my goals, but I wanted to, with the overall project, but I wanted to focus in on this concept of entrepreneurial citizenship that's in the book title, and talk a little bit about why I decided to characterize some of the policy and work processes that we're seeing in that way. So entrepreneurial citizenship characterizes something I found over 5 years of field work in India. I spent 9 months every day at the design firm, as Dr. Howard mentioned, and also studying the networks around the design firm. And I also visited India to test emerging hypotheses, study new developments in both policy and practice, and see how those might be challenged, complicated, or nuanced what I thought I was understanding as I went through my fieldwork. And over those 5 years of fieldwork, one thing that I found very consistently, I would say across the political spectrum of the kinds of people I met in middle-class India specifically, was that innovation was posed as a solution to nation building with entrepreneurialism as its engine. And in the book, what I try to do is to characterize the practices and then the emergent hierarchies of value, hierarchies among people, hierarchies among kinds of work, and hierarchies among modes of making change that are posited by this idea that innovation can be the solution to nation building. This formation I call entrepreneurial citizenship. So in the book, I argue that entrepreneurial citizenship is a system in which citizens are to absorb responsibilities for nation building by constructing markets, producing value, and directing projects towards more desirable futures. Of course, the question becomes, well, which futures are desirable to whom, and what democratic processes are there to collectively deliberate over that, a point that I'll come to in the end. I also point to how entrepreneurial citizenship then displaces, both ideologically and in practice, more democratic and social movement-based processes. So just to defamiliarize the idea of the entrepreneur a bit, before the 20th century, an entrepreneur meant someone who managed an enterprise, undertaking projects financed by others and seeing them through. Sort of a simple figure. So how did this figure become mythic, assumed in many institutions to be a normative model for social life? And what kinds of social relationships does this model imply when some are entrepreneurs and others are consumers, beneficiaries of social enterprises, and workers essential to production, but not the entrepreneurial leaders who we really need to be celebrating and valuing? Entrepreneurial citizenship as a concept names the policies that privilege innovation and those recognizable as innovators, the practices that reorganize social life to encourage entrepreneurial innovation, sometimes at the cost of other kinds of rights or democratic processes. And also it names the ways that people make sense of their own responsibilities to a wider polity as citizens through the lens of entrepreneurialism. So I named this formation entrepreneurial citizenship to make it easier to identify similar formations and processes happening in other places. While my book is a deep case study of India, and it very much locates entrepreneurial citizenship as something that makes sense to policymakers, industrial elites, and middle classes in India, because not just because they're absorbing an idea from Silicon Valley, but also because it makes sense given specific histories of understanding how to structure their democracy that I'll talk about. I saw that this kind of idea or formation was also happening in other countries, both post-colonial countries and even in the United States. So my claim is not to make a general, my hope is not to generalize entrepreneurial citizenship as something that's happening everywhere, but rather to offer what sociologists call a middle range theory, a theory that abstracts from the mess of everyday reality to show a social process that seems to happen in many places, but it's really up to the interpreter, the analyst, the policymaker, the person trying to make sense of their reality to decide what about this theory explains what's happening here in this different situation, this different context, and what needs modification. So in this talk, I'm going to talk for only about 30 minutes. And so I wanted to really focus on how this model of entrepreneurial citizenship reproduces inequality along lines of existing relations of gender, class, caste, and colonial legacies. And so to do that, I'm going to first talk about how the project of development as a project that legitimated the Indian post-independence state and its government, how did this project of development move from being the responsibility of the state to an opportunity for entrepreneurs to take up? And then I'll go to a case of how certain innovators in rural India are recognized and awarded for their contributions and creativity, but the ways that the recognition of innovation erases reproductive labor, it erases often women's contributions, and erases community contributions to how innovation and transformation happens. Then I'll move out of rural India into the design studio in Delhi, where there's a group of people who've come together because they want to participate in this project of entrepreneurial citizenship. But they are trying to participate in this project, making a living while making a life for themselves, as one of them put it. And they're doing so in a volatile global economy and competing with others who are also trying to make a life while making a living. And so this produces what I'm going to talk about as the anxieties of adding value at work, and the kinds of people that are privileged in that kind of competitive environment, and the kinds of people and contributions that are not. And I'll conclude by describing entrepreneurial citizenship as a model of transformation, but that very much starts from the middle classes and moves out while claiming to be democratic and something that everybody can actually participate in. So first, I want to explain how policy elites came to pose entrepreneurs as nation builders. How did development shift from a responsibility for the state to an opportunity for entrepreneurs? Shifts in political economy laid the groundwork for entrepreneurs as a solution to the problem of development. Delhi, during the time of my fieldwork, which is primarily 2010 through 2000, I would say 15, 16, the bulk being 2010, 11. Delhi at this time of my fieldwork seemed like a development boomtown. Since before independence, Delhi has been a center of development planning to modernize what Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India post-independence in the 1950s, what he had called the needy nation. So you have Delhi as a place where the government calculates and plans and trains cadres through the institutions to go out and design dams, industrialization projects, and create infrastructure. And then you have a needy nation that needs to kind of be brought into this modernity. But that central government's pre-liberalization 5-year plans and the import controls that were supposed to give India independence had, by the time of my fieldwork, given way to India opening itself up to markets, liberalizing its economy, and the government shifting from a role of planning to a role of facilitating public-private partnerships and the movement of capital investment. So in this shift, the central government turned to the entrepreneur as an agent of development through this process, and in this process also ceded power to industrialists, relaxed labor regulations, and ended many public monopolies. With liberalization, the once import substituting state began to cite private entrepreneurs as those who have to carry forward the work the state had been doing, building roads, creating hospitals, and supplying commodities. So India turned from an import substituting economy into one that had, as anthropologist Laura Baer argues, an India that had to be repackaged for private investment, to service, to generate extra revenue from those private investments that then can be used to service the sovereign debt that India as a country was in to banks that had loaned money to it, and to produce value for capital markets. So, this shift in political economy called on entrepreneurs to transform the problems and struggles of everyday life into sites of investable and profitable opportunities. With this shift, we also saw concrete shifts in citizenship policies that the Indian government instituted. So the state created new categories of inclusion. The person of Indian origin and non-resident Indian was meant to draw on diasporic and especially Silicon Valley expertise and wealth back to India. person of Indian origin, PIO, and non-resident Indian, NRI, gave rights of education, travel, investment, and property ownership to these diasporic citizens in other countries. And one thing to note there is that India has not only, India has citizens that have gone on to start startups and become very wealthy and successful in other countries, but India also has a large number of workers who go to the Middle East, not only as doctors, but also as construction workers and people who work in highly exploitative situations. But the general policy shift was about really, it first expanded inclusion to Indian diaspora in wealthier countries. And so I think it signals this kind of hierarchy of value of different kinds of Indians in this project of developing the economy. Within this shift to entrepreneurship, innovation also became very important. So in 5-year plans, innovation didn't really have much mention at all until the mid-2000s. And then by the late 2012, there was actually a whole chapter of the 5-year plan that was about innovation as a separate area from science and technology. But innovation really came to signify intellectual property and the priorities of India's technology industries. And so what I'm about to say is about understanding, why is it that innovators became so important as the most important kinds of entrepreneurs? And to understand that context, we had to understand that since the 1970s, India had enforced what was called process patents. Okay, so process patents say that if a product's invented somewhere out in the world, it is okay to figure out a way to produce that same product, say a pharmaceutical or a piece of software, as long as you come up with a different process for producing it. But by the mid-2000s, India, kind of pushed by both its tech capitalist part of the economy and also by the United States, signed on to the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement, TRIPS. And what TRIPS did was it signed India on to enforcing product patents. So a product patent means that it's not enough to figure out how to reverse engineer how to make a thing that's important for people to use in their daily lives. Product patents say that if that thing exists and has been invented somewhere else, you're not allowed to reproduce it. So the TRIPS agreement began to, it ended up forbidding the production of equivalent goods and then making the production of novel products a legal and moral imperative. And so it is in this context that I was watching a Davos panel with a number of like an Indian finance minister, an Indian bank CEO, and some people from Indian civil society talking about Indian development. And the CEO of ICICI Bank, Chanda Kochar, well, she's not the CEO anymore, she posed the question to the audience, how can we have public-private partnership work together in every field? Health, education, development is a responsibility for everyone and an opportunity for everybody. And so innovation becomes the call to develop these new products and services and to celebrate the people that do develop these new products and services while deprioritizing, say, building out the infrastructure to create access to products and services that people need. This call to make development opportunity for everybody made sense if you were in a particular class in India. The people that I studied and the people that I still am friends with are people, the kinds of people who have access to the internet, to global communities of people who are kind of in expert networks. These are globally connected middle classes. And India had a strong contingent of people who were in business schools in the United States, like the late C.K. Prahalad, who famously wrote a book called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. What that book argued was that you could eradicate poverty through profits by redirecting companies to develop products and services that don't only orient towards the emerging middle classes who have disposable income, but that actually products and services can be designed in particular to appeal to people at the very bottom of the income pyramid. So this fortune at the bottom of the pyramid, I talk in my book about why it became politically important at a particular moment in India, but I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. But what that did was that, this and ideas like this created this sense of, among the middle classes of, wait, if there's so many Indians who are abroad starting businesses in foreign lands, as this ad in the middle from the State Bank of India describes, if they're starting startups, if they're the pride of Silicon Valley, like, why can't we also start businesses that eradicate poverty through profits, that contribute to nation building? And I'll introduce you later to some people who started a studio with that kind of idea. But one of the things that I want to argue is that these efforts to create a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem in India and to participate in that ecosystem, it covers over the kinds of inequalities that make certain people able to access entrepreneurship or to take the time to invent. And it makes it seem like entrepreneurship can be something that just anybody can do. But actually it represents the interests of those who already have a lot of resources and access to networks to be able to mobilize these efforts. And so this last image on the right is a kind of artifact that I think illustrates this problem. The report is called Creating a Vibrant Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in India. And it's by the Government of India's Planning Commission, published in 2012. On the cover, you see the hands of a woman who's on the street. She doesn't have her own storefront. She doesn't have infrastructure. She's selling these colored powders that are used for rangoli and other kinds of decorative arts. This woman who's working in a kind of entrepreneurial hustle that's highly precarious. These street sellers are often harassed by police, especially as cities try to gentrify and present a cleaner image. She's being presented as the possibilities of a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem in India, but actually this report is on the Committee on Angel Investment and Early Stage Venture Capital. And the people on that committee represent the tech sector and the financial sector's interests as an industry. So this is the tension that I'm trying to bring to light in my work when we think and part of this tension is about the fact that for every entrepreneurial effort, there has to be some people who are workers who forward that effort. There are people who have to be consumers who experience a market where the choices that they have are determined by entrepreneurs. And so there's a kind of tiered structure where the entrepreneur is not just somebody who, as we often write about in social and cultural analysis and political economy, we don't talk about the entrepreneur as someone who's a neoliberal person who's dealing with neoliberalism and free markets by having to manage themselves and increase their own value in the marketplace. But what I found was that the entrepreneurial citizen here was also someone who manages others, someone who's kind of being deputized to steer the future of the nation, but there's many, many people being deputized. So this common sense elevates certain people as innovators and others as mere workers, consumers, or the otherwise affected. So who conceptualizes and valorizes and who does the work, and who modernizes whom and towards what horizon? This hierarchy of kind of who gets to guide the future was built on several building blocks. One were the ideas of Joseph Schumpeter. Schumpeter is an economist in the mid-20th century who saw the entrepreneur as a creative agent that generates novel sources of profit within an economy. The entrepreneur was an agent of innovation by finding new arrangements of existing resources, relationships, and techniques to organize novel forms of production. Crucially, he claimed that you could avoid the falling rate of profit that was supposed to produce a communist revolution by finding these new sources of value. So the entrepreneur here is really like a manager who finds things that they can bring together or finds things that they can extract from. The entrepreneurial citizen also made sense in India by drawing on older hierarchies of citizens in Indian society. So Nehru famously posited one India that plans, leads, and administers, and another that must be developed through education, work, health, and hygiene. Planners, scientists, and managers were meant to be separate from the squabbles of politics and systematically allocated resources so they could regulate production that would express what political theorist Partha Chatterjee has called the unitary will and consciousness of a very fragmented nation, a nation fragmented by language, religion. Gandhi had a different spin on elite leadership. He articulated a trusteeship system in which the very wealthy were seen, he saw the very wealthy as wealthy because of their cleverness, because of their intelligence. And their job in the trusteeship system was to keep their wealth, but to spend it wisely for the benefit of the wider public, including their own workers. So in both Nehru and Gandhi's case, you see what anthropologist Tanya Lee has called a system of trustees, elites who claim the right to speak for the well-being of the population. Although the trustees for Gandhi and Nehru, for Nehru, the trustees are the planners, the highly educated technocrats, and for Gandhi, it's those who, by dint of making their wealth, have demonstrated their cleverness. So what does this look like on the ground when we see efforts, when we see creative efforts that become potentially capitalized and made valuable as entrepreneurial enterprises? So for that, I want to talk about a specific story of how designers, middle-class citizens, and the government do work to recognize innovators, but in the process, erase the kinds of sustaining labors that are necessary for innovation to happen. So I want to start with a story about a lota. A lota is a very common vessel in India. It's used to carry water. It has symbolic significance as signifying bodies. And in 1958, Charles and Ray Eames, really famous designers in the United States, they were hired by the Ford Foundation to go to India. And they were evaluating what it would take to set up a National Institute of Design in India. And the thing that they decided to focus on in one part of their report was the lota, this what they called the simple vessel of everyday use that stood out to them as the greatest, the most beautiful. And they asked, okay, how would one go about designing a lota? And there are designers who are known for bringing together different disciplines, engineering, the arts, to create beautiful, usable objects. And so they start going through all the different factors: the size and strength and gender of the hands, the way it's supposed to be transported, the balance and center of gravity, the fluid dynamics, how it fits in the palm, and so on. But then they conclude, of course, no one man could have possibly designed the lota. The number of combinations of factors to be considered gets to be astronomical. No one man designed the lota, but many men over many generations. Okay, and I'm going to just bracket the gendered language here for now, but gender will come in later. Many individuals represented in their own way through something they may have added or may have removed, or through some quality of which they are particularly aware. So the lota here is a product of a long cultural process that allows for diversity of people adding things, modifying, but creating this recognizable pattern of a kind of device that is part of stitching together the fabric of Indian material and spiritual life. Now, in 2010, I was part of a group with the design studio that was going out to do field work and understand people's existing water practices. And so the story I want to share with you is about how designers made sense of the kind of everyday innovation and modification that the Eames gave such significance to in a world that privileges innovators. So for this project, people wanted to understand how people stored water, kept it cool. The goal was to design a water filter. And during the field work, they actually came across these two objects: a clay vessel and a plastic water bottle filled with water that were sitting by a pipe covered in a wet cloth. Sushmita was a woman who lived in the house where these bottles were found, and she had draped the soaked cloth and suspended the vessel, effectively creating an evaporative refrigerator with the items she had available to her. So when you have wet cloth and then the heat evaporates the water, that actually cools the contents inside. These wrapped vessels of evaporative cooling were sparked off the American development consultant who saw this, because for him, this was evidence that what people needed was a way to cool their water. It wasn't evidence of creativity and sustainability. It wasn't evidence of reusing things that you have found. It was evidence that what this design project needs to do, if it wants to create a water filter that people will want, well, it should also cool water, because that's something that people want. And in the design profession, these kinds of ethnographic observations actually have a name, and that name is the workaround. So IDEO has a book famously called Thoughtless Acts that I talk about, where they talk about how design ethnographers can go observe people's thoughtless acts or workarounds, and then seeing them evidence of a practice that needs intervention by a designer to make a more proper innovation, a more proper thing that can be bought on the market. And I argue in the book, a thing that can generate economic value. So in this context, Sushmita's creativity is not a solution that exists that should be valued as a design. It's something that is a signal for a need that can be served in ways that grow the economy better. In Hindi, there's also an Indian middle class concept of jugaad, which connotes clever improvisation that achieves the goal in highly constrained situations. And so designers also saw this as an example of a jugaad, something that shows the capacity to innovate, but is really jury-rigged. It's going to fall apart quickly. And as one strategy and innovation consultant writing in a business newspaper called it, jugaad has no design element or risk-taking. It's not born of research or from technical mastery, from identifying lacuna in customer needs or a eureka moment in the laboratory. So if we think back to that hierarchy of citizens that Nehru set up or Gandhi set up, where you have the planners or the managers who through their cleverness should be deciding how to properly serve the needs of the nation. We see in the dismissal of these cooling devices, that same kind of hierarchy at work, where yes, this is creativity, but it's messy. It's a kind of disordered form of modernity. Now, by contrast, this evaporative cooling device had its inventor celebrated as a hero. So the Mitti Cool is a refrigerator that works on the same principle as Sushmita's cooling vessel, but is one of the rural innovations Anil Gupta celebrates, a proper, reproducible, and scalable design. It not only creates use value, but exchange value for the nation. University of Iowa scholar Prashant Rajan conducted life histories of Prajapati and other rural innovators, almost all men. And his work, and this is not because of his bias, actually, the rural innovators that are recognized and awarded by the Indian government are almost all men. And I'll explain why I think that is. But Prashant Rajan's work on Prajapati, the inventor of this Mitti Cool refrigerator, illustrates the kind of support required to enable rural innovators to develop recognizably scalable inventions. Prajapati forged a relationship with a middle-class investor in a factory he worked in. Others Rajan talked to, they relied on salaries or day laborers working on their farm to generate food, and then the money that they made off of the farm like subsidized the inventive process. Others found wealthier patrons, had salaried relatives. And so what I want to point to here is that the labor of invention required the labor of also keeping life going. When Rajan wrote his case studies, there was one case study that particularly struck me. It was a case study of somebody who was working in a machine shop. He wanted to create a particular invention, and then his wife had medical problems. And so in that case study, the family talked about how this inventive process actually created a lot of precarity for their family, that it was difficult for them to pay medical bills, that parents had to get involved and work more in order to finance the kind of work of keeping life going. And so what I want to highlight here is when we highlight innovation and these innovators, we have to recognize that there's a community around it that not only provides the kind of creativity and modifications to the invention that the Eames might have talked about, but also the resources to keep the inventor going and to keep the life that to kind of move resources out into this what other analysts of entrepreneurial work have called kind of speculative labor where you don't know if you're going to get paid. Feminist anthropologist Megan Moody describes this as a kind of gendered peril in households that engage in entrepreneurial activity, where the pressure for keeping the kids fed and keeping the house together often ends up falling on women. So with this story, I really just wanted to illustrate that even when we say innovation is a collective effort, we usually focus on the creative aspects that contribute to conceptualization, but we also need to recognize the crucial role that care and food play. And when we recognize innovators who seem to come out of backgrounds that are more difficult, we often see behind the scenes still networks of resources or networks of relative privilege or access to relative privilege that have enabled these particular people to be singularized as innovators who can kind of spend long enough to scale their product and brand it and then get it out to market. So now I want to shift out of rural India into very much kind of Delhi, like in the thick of the design studios that I spent most of my field work in, and talk about what it looked like for a set of entrepreneurial workers who were not actually trying to spin up an enterprise, but they were trying to keep a design studio going and profitable and relevant, so they could work on things that they found personally interesting, so they could work on things that they felt contributed to nation building, and then they could make a living while doing it. And how in this structure, there was immense anxiety that they experienced about how they added value at work. So Dev Design is a studio where I did most of my, where I did the closest studies in my ethnography. And just to give you an introduction to them, they're a studio that ranged from about 6 people to 20 people. And what they did was, in some sense, make potential plans for futures. So to make that very concrete, they often worked on projects for clients, corporate social responsibility projects, often actually development NGOs, philanthropies. And what they specialized in is what they described as discovering opportunities by design through doing applied ethnography, and doing some kind of business strategy analysis and making presentations of here's where you could go as an organization to sustain yourself or to make money. They were quite entrepreneurial in themselves. They didn't just make one fixed product, these kind of client consultancy presentations. They also sometimes made performance art presentations, like this performance they created for a launch of the Red Hat platform in India, where poignantly it says you can own the new now and the future is what we build together. They also created network forums, places where they as a studio could both build networks of other social enterprises, philanthropies, entrepreneurial startups, and then they could, through building those networks and having conferences, they could create they can make sense of what was a shifting terrain of expertise, and shifting practices of development that they could then become leaders in. And these network forums also included activists. So the line between economic productivity and political action were totally blurred in this context. So one of the things that they did often was sort of think about what is it that we as a studio produce? What are we good at? And I was really surprised one day to hear a longtime dev design staff designer say, we've cracked the design research thing enough that we can get clients like the Gates Foundation coming to us now. But if we're experts, what are we experts of? I was surprised to hear this, because if you think about people at the studio being having the task of selling their services to clients, you'd think that they have a well-packaged message about it. But I think what this quote actually speaks to is that well-packaged message is at any point a temporary snapshot of how these entrepreneurial designers are shifting the kind of expertise that they say that they provide as their clients' needs change, as the competition changes. But this kind of shifting to follow the market for their services was in tension with another value that was deeply held at dev design. As another designer put it, the point of dev design is to create a space where each of us can put something of ourselves into the work that we do. So they started dev design because they had previously been working for companies like Accenture or Pepsi, global multinationals, where they felt like they were tasked with localizing what is ultimately products and services that are designed by managers in the global north. And they wanted to have more of that kind of creative agency themselves. This creative agency became a kind of, a way for them to aspire to develop themselves and make a living through this work. But it actually was really important to what the studio produced as well, because what the studio produced and promised clients was the ability to take a cultural pulse assess business opportunities, and come up with opportunities for that company to intervene and kind of positively influence the future in ways that are beneficial to the company, or in the ways that, say, the development agency wants to influence the future. And so the personal connections to arts, to activism, and to passions became a kind of intellectual input into this problem of, we need to take the cultural pulse to make sure this intervention will be successful. And this was reflected in the job call that the studio posted on its website. They look for somebody who has great attention to detail, can source information from across geographies and organizations accurately and quickly. And then they specifically wanted to hire people who had independent creative work, such as writing, photography, and films, and an entrepreneurial bent. And these were kind of the basic job attributes. There wasn't a lot of strong definition to the job. So they wanted someone who would bring something of themselves to the studio, and they wanted that something of themselves to be someone who had demonstrated already a creative and networked practice that could bring other influences and skills so the studio could change and be flexible over time. This really sparse job description could make it very anxiety producing to work at the studio. At the studio, people were constantly at the studio, there was an effort constantly to keep the studio small, so the studio members wouldn't have to feel like they were managing lots of other people. So that meant that they were very selective about who got to stay around. And they very much wanted people who could manage themselves. And people were constantly asked by people more senior to them, so what value do you add to the studio? And people also ask this of each other kind of behind the scenes, like, what value do you think she adds? Like, I'm not sure she's really adding value. People who were quiet were less obviously recognizable as adding value into the studio. If they were the kind of person who's taking a lot of notes during the meeting, but not participating very vocally in brainstorms. People who got pulled into less glamorous tasks were seen as adding less value, even if those less glamorous tasks are important. And so, like, this came up in a bunch of different examples where, a graphic designer, it was in one case, a graphic designer was kind of creating all these little graphical elements for a film project they had to make. And he thought, this was donkey work, and he kind of wished that he could outsource it, but it would also be too much work for him to outsource it. So he kind of devalued this essential labor. Even as he was he had to do it for his creative practice. Another woman was an accomplished photographer who was also quieter. She would do a lot of social media management, and she called this sweatshop girl work. When people were using these problematic terms that associate certain kinds of work with with animals, or they associate these kinds of work with people of color who are working in their own political economies, there's a kind of divestment of solidarity with the people who are actually doing that essential work, even when it was themselves, in favor of valuing this kind of creative work that lets you be authentic, that lets you express your free will. And then in the studio, there's a whole other tier of workers who maintain the infrastructure. And that part of the office worked primarily in Hindi. They got paid far less, and they put food on the table for lunches. They drove people to pick up materials or do errands that were necessary for projects. They handled accounting and operations issues. So the point I want to make in this case is that the studio was trying to figure out how it's going to fit itself in a global supply chain that's constantly shifting based on how the free market values people's labors. And in doing all that shifting, they were trying to pursue creativity for themselves, but rather than disavowing an economic structure that assigns value to labor only based on what the market will bear, rather than the fact that that labor is necessary, they kind of divested solidarity there. And as a result, they constantly themselves were subject to this anxiety of having to document their own practices, make sure that the people senior to them knew what they were doing, making sure that they were always pivoting what they were doing. It was a kind of unresolved contradiction in the work. And I also wanted to highlight something that's in common between this case, the studio, and the last case, which is in both the design studio and in these sites of rural innovation, we have a kind of erasure of the necessary kind of reproductive labors of of feeding people, of maintaining infrastructures so that inventors or putatively creative people can go off and invent and dream, even as it's again as it's essential to be able to mobilize those resources. So I want to conclude by reflecting on what kind of model for change entrepreneurial citizenship is. This model that relies on kind of the creative agency of some, that relies on but disavows the necessary labors and creativity of others. I spotted this Rolex ad in The Economist in 2013. It promises that anyone can change everything. The anyones here are crucially people of color rather than familiar white saviors. Social enterprise promised a world without poles, where global South elites can be presented as grassroots South-South achievement. And you can imagine that someone selling colors on the street is just the same as a designer in a studio, in that they're contributing in an entrepreneurial way to the formation of their material culture. Going back to colonialism, we know that anthropologists work for states or companies to produce knowledge about difference and about culture in service of governmentality and extraction. Knowledge constructing traditions, constructing ideas of castes, for example, helped render kind of terra incognita navigable by these companies and states in the colonial times. Today, entrepreneurs appeal to a wider set of patrons: financiers, philanthropies, government agencies, and companies. They too draw on applied anthropology and resource maps, but they also search themselves, their communities, their passions to construct opportunities. Julia Eliachar argues that the idea of the bottom of the pyramid as a source of innovation emerges in part out of critiques of development as a universal top-down expertise. Entrepreneurs, in this case, children of India's governing classes, the people who have the privilege who have access to land, who have access to resources to be able to undertake an entrepreneurial effort, they appear as another post-colonial resolution to this problem of top-down development. They become what I'm arguing is a model that's supposedly about bottom-up change, but is really change from the middle out. At the same time, this model of change from the middle out had a really tense relationship to democratic processes and to social movements who would challenge the visionary plans of entrepreneurs, of corporate leaders. And the way that this came up in fieldwork was people talking about, what do you do when you have a development project? Or what do you do when you have an innovation project that people are raising alarm bells about, or people are resisting? This was actually at a conclave I was at. A journalist put this question to a social innovation panelist. And the social innovation panelist said, well, there's the Steve Jobs model of innovation where people don't know what they want, but when you give it to them, they'll accept it. And this was a model that came up actually over and over in my fieldwork, where people who did not understand an entrepreneurial vision were seen as fearful, were seen as undereducated. And the Steve Jobs model of kind of bold change with very little regulations in the way became a kind of justification for reducing the power of democratic claims people had to also guide and structure those changes. So in this talk, I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. In this talk, I hope I've shown you some of the limits of this vision of how change happens through entrepreneurialism. First, ideologies of innovation take collective processes of creation and encourage the identification of singularized hero inventors to whom vision, conception, and agency is attributed, while erasing the other kinds of sustaining labors and resources that people pull together to make this possible. And second, this ideology then devalues sustaining labors and therefore kind of erases the importance of the rights of those who do provide this sustenance from the realm of policy and public discussion. And so the question I want to leave us with is this model of kind of many kinds of change, many kinds of creativity from the middle out, the model by which we want to actually run our democracies, or do we need to search for other models? So with that, thank you very much. I'm sorry I went longer than I intended to. I really appreciate you being here and questions I'm seeing show up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lily. Yeah, I think I share your interest in economist ads as a source of inspiration or something to rebel to. It's amazing how they can inspire inspire entire research agendas. I want to ask a question. So I want to remind everybody, please drop your questions into the chat. We're a small group. If you want to raise your hand and ask in person, I'll call on you. But I want to ask you, I think the first time we met was over lunch in Seattle when you'd returned from field work, but were looking to produce the book manuscript. And since then, there have been a number of prominent people like presidents who said globalization is dead or over. And some of the things that you talk about, the notion of entrepreneurial citizenship, are so deeply entwined in that bottom of the pyramid, green collective responsibility and micro entrepreneurship. Do you think that the entrepreneurial citizen is still, is it dissolving in some way in the current environment, or is it tightening because of the gig economy? What do you, since you published the book, do you think the concept holds? Yeah.
It's a good question. I mean, some of the forces that I see shifting, so I think about it less, when I think about whether the concept holds, I think about does the concept hold its appeal? I guess, does it have its persuasive power? In India, I think the persuasive power I think it's still alive, to be honest. On the one hand, a lot of people that I talked to in tech in India were really frustrated post 2016 because they were starting to see that the government was favoring certain companies, and so in the tech industry. So when India demonetized and pushed a bunch of people onto kind of payment transfer platforms, there are rumors that the Indian government had met with Paytm before this big announcement, and Paytm actually gained tons of customers. The fight over net neutrality in India is in some ways a fight for entrepreneurial opportunity, because they don't want Facebook and then the telecom giant Reliance to be able to determine which startups are going to be privileged in terms of having access to the Indian market. And so in that sense, like entrepreneurial citizenship, like this idea, it's like there are actors who are changing politics because of it. And I think recently Modi said that one of the solutions to COVID will be that we need to see innovation. But actually, one of the big things that ended up being an issue with COVID relief in India was getting both getting the patents on the vaccines developed in the global north released, which was already built into the TRIPS policy, actually. So I'm not entirely sure why they had to kind of get approval for that. And then building out the infrastructure to actually create the vaccines. Like, that's not an innovation problem. That's a reverse engineering problem. It's a manufacturing problem. That's putting out infrastructure problem. Getting people vaccines is going to require lots and lots of people who are like public health workers in India. And there's a big public health network that's been built up over the decades to reach out into villages. It's going to require resourcing them, getting them PPE. I think in that sense, like I think entrepreneurial citizenship is still being deployed as a promising solution. And I think it's still missing the point. I've argued. I think in the United States, I've seen a lot of, I do see a diminishment of the appeal of entrepreneurial citizenship among the people it's supposed to appeal to, the people who are supposed to go start startups. But I do still see a kind of claim that Silicon Valley should be left, to innovate, and policy can't catch up. And we need to.
It also, the way you describe it, it also seems to be something that you extract out of a population, right? You identify innovations and you remove them, commercialize them, and sell them back in some way. There's a great question from Gina, which means it didn't actually travel very far to get to my screen, but it's here. Can you reflect on the intersectional gender dynamics of the middle class entrepreneurship in India?
Yeah, or the kind of middle out is what I'm kind of calling it. But for this talk, I just kind of was shortening it that way. It's a great question. So I think, one set of dynamics, maybe the way to come into it is by thinking about, if we think about the example, so a lot of examples of how I saw people getting resources for their entrepreneurial efforts. And I was studying more kind of middle class people who are educated in English, in IITs and in elite business schools. And I was also studying their efforts to engage people like in rural areas or engage other people in projects of entrepreneurship. But so in this particular kind of elite educated, like India born and raised class, like a lot of how people would build networks of resources and build networks of kind of partners who could help them get their ventures off the ground was through educational networks or through family networks. So educational networks through the IITs, Indian Institute of Technology. Ajanta Subramanian has written a book called Making Merit that details the ways that despite the fact that there's affirmative action that does give people from lower castes in India access to the IITs, there's still ways that the networks that form in the IITs are still caste-based, that people who get in through the affirmative action process are presumed to have less knowledge, to be less competent, and to somehow dilute merit. So so the reliance on these kind of elite institutions as both a place to network and then also as an institution that stamps Indians with credibility when they go to talk to potential business partners, that reproduces the caste dominance of upper castes in India, while just kind of making it look like, oh yeah, like I was just resourceful and I had these great networks. Getting money from financial networks also, reproduces class relationships of like who has intergenerational accumulated wealth that works out in really complicated ways in different regions. And then I would say that in terms of gender, I think like one, I think especially if you kind of look at, I think if you look at less wealthy people, women are often held responsible. If women work outside the house, they're also responsible to manage the house. And so it's much more difficult, I think, for women who don't have lots of resources to hire help in the household to actually go out and develop those kinds of relationships that would bring resources to an entrepreneurial venture. And last, actually, I think that would be, yes, the last point is like this, there's studies of the IT industry in India is like one example where you have kind of the call center, IT enabled services sector, and then you have the kind of software sector. It's all called the IT industry, but actually the IT enabled services is the lower paid sector, and that's 80% women. The IT workers who are doing the software engineering, who might be in a position to go start their own software startups, is actually 20% women. And so you also have kind of, you can also look at how gendered pipelines of access to the kinds of institutions where one would get trained and then build networks in IT, like would militate against women's kind of participation and kind of at least a digital India vision of entrepreneurship.
Right. And so we're at the top of the hour. Can you stay for another 5 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So there's a great question from Nayana Prakash here. You had mentioned Modi, and she's asking a little bit about perhaps the BJP's specific imprint on entrepreneurial citizenship. She mentions the Made in India movement banning Chinese apps. And I imagine there's with the BJP, there's a nationalist element to whatever they would imagine innovation should look like for India. What do you think about the particular impact of the BJP?
It's a really, really great question. And I hope Nayana Prakash, I hope you do some writing about this actually, and I'd love to know what you think. It seems to me that the BJP, one of the things I found interesting when I was researching my book was that the BJP and Congress, the kind of more centrist party, actually supported very similar policies in terms of innovation policy, science and technology funding, relaxing labor protections, but they had different ways that they would narrate what they would kind of create these specific wedge issues, when they're fighting in elections to draw people's attention to. But to the point that Nayana is making, I would say that the BJP still very much is subjecting people in India to the pressures of international markets. The farmers' protests were which brought millions of people out onto the streets, were precisely about exposing farmers to market volatility by removing kind of fixed prices for crops, price protections for crops, and also then opening up agriculture to a kind of flexibility for the big ag tech industry in India. So I think that if I were to characterize it, I would say that maybe the BJP is able to impose more violently in removing protections that would impede entrepreneurialism, because they have a kind of nationalist and religious movement that they're expanding, and they've gotten allies among Dalits even now that allow them to kind of get away with that violence in a way that maybe Congress couldn't. So I think demonetization is another example of that, where, you know, the people woke up one morning and their 500,000 rupee notes didn't work anymore. And so people lost access to medical care, like they were planning weddings, they didn't have money anymore, they stayed in line for days, like some people died, but BJP didn't suffer in the elections because of it, because they narrated it as a kind of service to the country. So
so they can keep the narrative going. I guess that's the power of narrative. There's a fabulous question from Dr. Corinne Cathsbeth here about resisting entrepreneurial citizenship. Is it possible to resist? And if I could also combine one from Forrester, is the gig economy a mode of resistance, or is it an empty form of resistance? How do you resist?
Okay, well, so to me, like, I'll start with the gig economy one, because that is something that's growing a lot in India. And so I see the gig economy as a classic example of entrepreneurial citizenship that privileges the tech companies that are promising to create all these jobs, and their rights to set the term, their rights to kind of centralize the determination of the terms of employment. Now, India has had a vast informal economy with highly exploitative labor relations, like many other places, for a really long time. But I think the gig economy is all about scaling it up and centralizing it and making it so, you know, this company now can kind of control the surplus value or the revenues, as opposed to like lots and lots of diffuse shopkeepers who are hiring guys on motorcycles to go deliver the food or something like that, if that makes sense. So I don't see the gig economy as any form of resistance to these shifts. I think it actually highlights what's at stake in having scaled up innovation be a model of organizing things. Then to then Dr. Cathsbeth's question, how do you resist it as both like in educational, for example, in educational institutions? I mean, some of what I do, well, actually, okay, I'll start with the people that maybe afterlife of the folks that I've met in my research, and some who I'm still in touch with. You know, I think being in dialogue with people who are experiencing these processes, but are not totally invested in the ideology, it can be important. So I found that the people at the lower levels of the studio actually were really receptive to the book, because they were like, oh, you put your finger on something that I kept thinking was my fault. Like I wasn't like doing my work-life balance enough, or like I wasn't explaining my, you know, things to the clients well enough, but it's actually kind of not, that's never really going to work. And then, you know, sticking to how people are experiencing the contradictions in their own lives and bodies. So a friend of mine who worked at the studio, you know, actually several friends, like they worked so hard, they traveled so much, they ended up getting really major health problems. One of those people has actually now joined the Communist Party of India as an organizer. Not my doing, but you know, sticking to how people feel these things, you know, or when they have a client that like won't listen to their advice about what they think is actually right. Like recognizing that people might have genuine ideals to improve their communities that send them into these projects, and they're being called into a mode of participation. And so then identifying the contradictions that they're feeling, I think can be very powerful. And then pointing people to alternative models of solidarity. So when you run into the contradictions, is it your fault, or is it a policy issue, or is it the way that these things are funded? What are the ways that we need to change the rules of the game, in Eric Olin Wright's words, in order to make it so you don't experience these contradictions? I try to incorporate that into my teaching. I try to explain that, you know, there's groups like Tech Worker Coalition that organize to try to change the rules of the game, or to at least collectively help each other problem solve at work in a way that's not just going to human resources and looking for a solution there. But I would love to hear what other people think are possible modes of resistance. So please keep in touch or put in the comments.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us, sharing your latest work. Can you say something? Are you going to go back to India as a field site, or do you have a new field site in mind somewhere?
I have been, since writing the book, I have been pulled into dealing with entrepreneurial citizenship where I live. So in the city of San Diego, in 2015, 2016 or so, installed 6,000 or 3,000 what they call smart street lights that are supposed to kind of have video and audio and provide all this data that was going to be useful for building a tech entrepreneur economy. Like people who could use that data, make civic apps, and then as the streetlight system by GE Current got installed in other cities, like our entrepreneurs could have the leading edge. And the streetlight system became a surveillance system for the police, and none of the cool data generation stuff for planning and civic tech apps ever even worked. So I've been trying to put this concept to work to diagnosing some of the policy problems we have here for now. And then, but I would love to work with people who feel that some kind of solidarity would be useful. And I still remain concerned with and have friends and people I care about in India. And
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that invitation. Wonderful way to end. A pleasure to have you. Pleasure to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Irani. Thank you, Professor Howard. Thank you for the fascinating insight today. And thank you everyone for attending. And you'll receive a follow-up email in due course. And please do visit the events page on our website to sign up for our last few events of the academic year. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.